The altar, the Son, and the covenant, a journey of radical obedience. Here are 7 biblical teachings from the story of God, Abraham, and Isaac. Number 1. How a covenant works. God's request for Abraham to offer Isaac was a divine setup, not of cruelty, but of covenant. Isaac was not just a child, he was the promised heir, the beginning of a generational covenant. The covenant with God required Abraham to align spiritually by offering back what was promised. This act proved Abraham's faith and trust in God, who owns the promise and governs its unfolding. Commands Abraham to walk before me and be blameless, and I will make my covenant between me and you. In this, we learn that God's promises are not automatically fulfilled, they are activated by obedience and upheld by relationship. This covenant was more than just a personal blessing. It was a divine agreement involving future generations. Abraham was not merely being tested, he was being trusted. Isaac was a spiritual seed, and offering him meant returning the seed to the one who gave it. Only then could God unlock the generational blessings tied to Isaac. The promise involved Abraham, but the covenant belonged to God. Where a promise is given, God watches our faith and obedience as a response before he moves. Number 2. The law of detachment. To walk in full obedience, Abraham had to detach emotionally and spiritually from Isaac, the very symbol of the promise. Until you are willing to release the promise, you are not ready to carry its full weight. John 12:24 reminds us, "Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it produces much grain." Detachment is not disowning the promise, but surrendering control so God can multiply it beyond your grasp. Abraham had already failed once when he tried to fulfill God's promise by his own plan through Hagar and Ishmael. This time, God was asking for full surrender. Isaac represented a fulfilled prophecy, but now that seed had to go back to God so that the greater phase of the covenant, the nation building, could begin. Until Abraham proved he could lay the promise down, he wasn't ready to transfer it into God's hands for generational fulfillment. Number 3. How the altar works. The altar is not just a place of sacrifice, it is a place of spiritual transaction. Genesis 22:12 says, "Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." The altar becomes the point where man meets God with his most treasured possession. It is where promises are tested, obedience is displayed, and God's covenant is secured. Abraham built the altar as an act of obedience, and it became the platform for divine transition. The act of laying Isaac on the altar was symbolic of returning the promise to God so he could bring forth a new generation. The altar allowed the covenant to shift from man's control into God's dominion. It shows that until something is laid down on the altar, it is not truly submitted. Number 4. The place of emotions. God had to remove emotional attachment from the mission. Abraham could not be led by affection for Isaac. He had to be led by faith in God. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." Emotions are not evil, but when they compete with obedience, they must be surrendered. Abraham's still heart revealed a focused spirit. Like Jesus in Gethsemane, Luke 22:42, Abraham said in action, "Not my will, but yours be done." When the mission is spiritual, emotional decisions can lead to compromise. God knows that emotional attachments can block spiritual obedience. To move forward in faith, God removes the comfort zones and calls us into a realm of trust. Abraham didn't argue or delay. He rose early and obeyed. 5. Promise versus covenant. The promise was given to Abraham, but the covenant belonged to God. A promise can be declared over your life, but it is in obedience that the covenant is activated. Genesis 17:7 calls it an everlasting covenant, eternal, sacred, and beyond one man. Abraham showed that God's blessings are not activated by entitlement, but through alignment. Obedience is the access key. The promise involved Abraham's desires, but the covenant pointed to God's divine agenda for nations and generations. Until Abraham proved he was not emotionally enslaved to the promise, he could not be a channel for the covenant. God cannot give you what he cannot have his glory in. Isaiah 42:8. He's a jealous God, and his covenant cannot be shared with fleshly motivations. Number 6. The power of spiritual transfer. Isaac wasn't just spared, he inherited. The test Abraham passed became a spiritual deposit in Isaac's life. Isaac saw his father obey, trust, and surrender. That same spirit rested on Isaac, which is how generational faith is born. Covenant doesn't die with the father, it flows to the son. This is how God moves promises through generations. From that moment onward, Isaac carried more than blood, he carried a spiritual mantle. The covenant expanded because Abraham showed he could steward a promise, surrender it, and still worship. This pattern of surrender and obedience becomes a spiritual inheritance that multiplies in descendants. Psalm 112 verse 2 says, "His descendants will be mighty on earth. The generation of the upright will be blessed." Number 7. Surrender as the gateway to multiplication. God cannot glorify himself in what you refuse to surrender. Isaiah 42 verse 8 says, "I am the Lord, my glory I will not give to another." God will test the promise in your hands to ensure it hasn't replaced him in your heart. Spiritual maturity demands we give God what's dearest to us, knowing he can resurrect, multiply, and fulfill it beyond our control. The altar, the test, the detachment, all of it is preparation to steward the generational covenant. Until the seed is broken, the fruit cannot multiply. God will never share his covenant with a man who idolizes the promise. Abraham passed the test, not just for himself, but for the legacy that would flow through Isaac, through Jacob, through Israel, and ultimately through Christ. True surrender positions us for divine multiplication, spiritual legacy, and fulfilled destiny. If this message has touched you, like, share so that it can reach someone who needs such spiritual nourishment at the moment. Shalom.